Though circumstances never seemed to allow Stilicho to immediately deal with these invasions into Italy, no one could deny that when he finally was able to act, he brought a swift conclusion to the crisis. In August of 406 then, Stilicho was at the high watermark of his career, twice now the savior of Italy, and he took the political capital he had earned and decided to spend it on his long-standing pet project of unifying the East and West under his personal control. The claims to regency over Arcadius were now a bit absurd. After all, the emperor was now in his late 20s, but that did not stop Stilicho from pressing for territorial concessions from Constantinople. Specifically, he demanded the return of the eastern half of Illyria, which, as you'll recall, had been ceded over to the east to create a unified theater of command for Theodosius right after the Battle of Adrianople. Stilicho thought it right and proper that it be returned to the purview of the Western Augustus, immediately. His saber-rattling on the issue included a threat to go to war to protect Honorius' claim to the territory, and possibly messages sent to Alaric pressing the Gothic king to once again go out a-plundering in Thrace. But all this saber-rattling was brought to a dramatic halt on New Year's Eve 406. Remember those Vandals and Alans who had been stopped in 401? Well, they were back on the move, this time joined by Burgundians and Alemanni. On the last day of 406, they crashed through the line that had been weakened when Stilicho brought down troops to deal with Radagaisus. Unpacified barbarians were now spilling across the border. Next week, we will deal with the deep consequences of this invasion. For starters, no, they never will be turned back. These Vandals are the same Vandals who will eventually wind their way down into North Africa and set up an independent kingdom for themselves. But more immediately, the invasion will lead to the complete political breakdown of the Northwestern Empire. Revolts and counter-revolts will lead to havoc far beyond the presence of a few barbarians, most dramatically demonstrated by the Roman withdrawal from Britain in 410. The end times are upon us, and the walls are crumbling down. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 100,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again, audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you qualify for free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book download. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. This week, I am going to go with a recommendation from listener Nick Dunleavy, Winston Churchill's The Second World War, the groundbreaking history of the war as told by one of its principals. I haven't read it myself, but just knowing that it exists makes me happy. The history of Rome has very rarely been able to rely on first-hand accounts from people actually in the tent when decisions were made, that when you get to something like Caesar's commentaries, you sit up and take notice. Churchill's history should probably be read with the same skeptical eye that we read Caesar, but it should definitely be read. Or listened to, anyway. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 162, Opening the Floodgates. On New Year's Eve 406 AD, a massive horde of barbarians crashed across the Lower Rhine and began spilling into the interior of the Roman Empire. The mixed group included Vandals, Alans, Burgundians, and Alemanni, and their combined strength overwhelmed the local Roman defenses. Well, local Roman defenses isn't entirely accurate. For the most part, the legions proper had been pulled south, either to bolster the defenses of the Upper Rhine or to augment Stilicho's Italian army as he faced off against Radagaisus's invading Goths. The northern section of the frontier was thus protected only by the allied Franks. The Franks fought hard to stop the invasion. After all, the Lower Rhine was now as much their territory as it was the Romans', but they were simply unable to hold the line. So the hordes poured in, and when they did, they triggered a series of upheavals that completely remade the political map of the Western Empire. Stilicho, as I mentioned at the end of last week, got this news while he was in the middle of rattling his saber at Constantinople and demanding the return of Illyria to the western sphere of influence. Sitting at the head of an army that had been reinforced by troops from the Rhine, and some 12,000 Gothic warriors from Radagaisus's group, Stilicho was feeling pretty confident about his military position and wanted to press home his advantage. Now, there are some good long-term reasons for Stilicho being so obsessed with the return of Illyria. For starters, it was the gateway to Italy, and with Constantinople showing little interest in using its resources to defend the eastern ends of the Alpine passes, the leaders of the Western court needed to take matters into their own hands. Beyond that was the fact that Illyria was a prime recruiting ground for soldiers. Stilicho had taken a lot of flack from the Senate for his reliance on barbarian mercenaries, but at the same time, they had consistently resisted all efforts to draft young men from their estates into service. So Illyria promised to be a nice answer to the conundrum. But though these were noble and legitimate reasons for Stilicho's eastern focus, there was no escaping the fact that the decision to use his newly enlarged army as a political tool to menace Constantinople necessarily meant leaving the northern Rhine frontier dangerously under-garrisoned. Though the particulars are different, this all reminds me a great deal of the Empire round about 260, when Gallienus chose to prioritize the Danube frontier over the Rhine frontier. Rather than playing the role of Postumus and adopting a purely Western-centric political and military posture, Stilicho instead decided to play the role of Gallienus, turn his attention east, and essentially leave Gaul to its fate. The Romans had defeated Radagaisus in August of 406, which left Stilicho plenty of time to send the Rhine legions back north, possibly even reinforced by the new Gothic recruits before winter set in. But he was so intent on the east that he kept his forces united in Italy. Gaul was overwhelmed by invading barbarians, permanently, I might add, just 6 months later. Then again, Italy had been invaded twice in the last 5 years, so Stilicho's decision to focus on his eastern flank rather than his northern flank is somewhat understandable. But in choosing to follow Gallienus's lead, Stilicho all but guaranteed that someone would step in to play the role of Postumus. And as soon as the barbarians crossed into Gaul, that someone stepped up. Right on cue, Flavius Claudius Constantius, the senior commander on the island of Britain, and the man history will come to know as Constantine III, was hailed as Augustus by his troops in early 407. So now, the West was not just under attack, it was in. Constantine III was in no way related to his namesake, nor was he related in any way to any existing noble family. He was a common soldier who had risen up through the ranks, and he attained his senior command by way of a military coup. The Roman occupation of Britain was gasping its last in the early 400s, and one of the symptoms of its fatal affliction was a breakdown in the solidarity of the occupying forces themselves. In 406, a series of coups and counter-coups threw up and then threw out senior generals at a frightening clip. When the invasion of Gaul began, a man named Gratian, about whom we know nothing, happened to be in charge. As the reports came in describing the barbarian flood, Gratian hesitated over whether to respond, irking the patriotic Roman element of the British army, who wanted to immediately cross over to Gaul and help turn back the hordes. ambitious and capable, Constantine exploited Gratians in action, promised that if he were in charge, they would have sailed for Gaul yesterday, and then successfully ousted Gratian from power. Good to his word, after being hailed as Augustus, Constantine gathered up all the mobile Roman forces on the island, put them on ships, and sailed them for Gaul. To which the people of Britain said, "Wait, what now? All of the Roman mobile forces? Can't you just..." But it was too late. The Romano-British citizens could only watch them go. "Okay, but what about us? Hello? Are you leaving for good, or what? Hello?" As soon as he arrived in northern Gaul, Constantine set about winning the loyalty of every Roman garrison in the area. Glad just to have someone around who seemed interested in doing something about the barbarians, the local troops were easily won over, and pretty soon Constantine had a decent-sized force behind him. But though his army was growing, it was still in no shape to head off into battle just yet, and so the invading barbarians were free to roam northern Gaul unimpeded. They sacked city after city, including the fairly important city of Mainz, before turning their attention to Trier itself. But the old capital of Gaul was too heavily fortified, and after a bitter but unsuccessful siege, the barbarians peeled off in search of easier targets. Constantine, meanwhile, identified an isolated group of Saxons as a good place to start his campaign, and attacked them as soon as his army was ready to fight. Though the battle itself couldn't have been more than a glorified skirmish, when Constantine defeated the Saxons, it was a huge propaganda boon to his cause. To the citizens of Gaul, and eventually Spain, Constantine became a man worthy of their loyalty and their taxes, unlike those imperial do-nothings down in Ravenna, who sucked them dry and then left them to die. Stilicho's response to the invasion of Gaul was clearly not all that it should have been. But in his defense, I would like to note that he was up against one of the all-time great obstacles to adequate responses: lack of information. With winter raging and the local Gallic ministry now headquartered down in Lyon, dispatches from the northern front were few, and the descriptions they contained were vague. "Oh, by the way, some barbarians have crossed over the Rhine and you should probably send reinforcements." But a hostile tribe crossing the Rhine was a regular event these days, and everyone always wanted reinforcements. Given his immediate reaction to the crisis, and then his later reaction when spring came and much more detailed reports came in, it is difficult to conclude that Stilicho thought something huge was underway in Gaul, and simply chose to ignore it. Because, though he had spent the winter positioning his army for a potential war with Constantinople, even after reports of the invasion had come down, as soon as spring came and Stilicho discovered how bad things really were, he wheeled them around and pointed them toward Gaul. Unfortunately for everyone, Stilicho's only immediate response to the crisis was to send a group of allied Vandals, who had been settled in Pannonia, up into Gaul to reinforce the local defenses. You can imagine the reaction of the leaders of Trier when this new horde of Vandals showed up on their doorstep, claiming that Stilicho had sent them, and let us in because we're hungry. I wouldn't believe that line in a million years, not after I had just spent a week fighting tooth and nail against some other horde of Vandals. So, these reinforcements were predictably denied access to the city. But without supplies of their